February 25, 2022. Port of Point Lezus, Trinidad Island, Caribbean Sea. 5 professional divers, Christopher Boudram, Faisal Kurban, Rishi Nagasar, Yusuf Henry, and Kazim Ali Jr., were carrying out repair work at depth off the coast of the island nation of Trinidad and Tobago. All 5 men had been sent to repair a leaking section of an oil pipeline that transported crude oil from ships directly to the shoreline. The management of the diving company had tasked them with fixing a leaking segment of the underwater oil pipeline running along the seabed of the Caribbean Sea. This was supposed to be just another ordinary Friday workday for the team. Each of them was a family man, eagerly looking forward to the evening when they could return home to their loved ones and enjoy a well-deserved weekend. But no one could have imagined what would happen with a single turn of a wrench. The consequences were truly horrifying. This incident is unique in its kind, perhaps the only one of its kind in the world. Sensitive souls may genuinely feel uneasy just hearing about the conditions these men endured. But right now, you are about to learn every tiny detail and fact about an accident that should never have happened. Before I dive into the main events, let me give you some essential background. It's crucial because it will help you form a clearer picture in your mind. In 2021, exactly 1 year before the events I'm describing, the state-owned oil company Peria discovered a leak in one of the risers of the underwater pipeline connecting Berth 5 and Berth 6. To reduce the risk of water pollution and further oil spills, the company carried out an emergency repair using its own resources. But because that repair was essentially just a temporary patch, Peria announced a tender. The tender called for the replacement of a section of the underwater riser on marine pipeline number 36 between berths 5 and 6. The pipeline was 365 meters long, with a diameter of 75 centimeters, about 30 inches. 5 specialized companies submitted bids, but only one, LMCS, provided all the required documentation and won the contract. It's worth noting that this diving service company had a slight advantage. 2 years earlier, its divers had successfully completed almost identical work on the opposite riser of the same pipeline. In other words, LMCS already had valuable experience with this exact type of job. Repair work began on January 18th. In accordance with the contract, the contractor started draining the 198 cubic meters of oil that remained in the pipe. The pipeline was purged with air from berth 5 to berth 6 over several days. Finally, on Friday, February 4th, the pipeline was fully drained. On February 13th, the diving team installed 2 plugs in the riser at berth 6. The first, lower, plug was a large cylinder designed to prevent water from entering the pipe from above and to block toxic gases released by residual fuel. Above that, the divers installed a second metal plug for additional protection. Once both plugs were in place, the underwater work could begin. As you can imagine, performing such complex tasks underwater requires a high level of precision and quality. That's why the diving company decided to carry out the work inside a special air-filled chamber known as a habitat. This square chamber measured 2.5 by 2.5 meters. It allowed the divers to perform a wide range of tasks without wearing full scuba gear. Constant oxygen was supplied, so they could remove their regulators or cumbersome equipment. The habitat was installed directly around the 75 centimeters pipe, which served as the start of the oil pipeline. The work progressed without any issues, and by the evening of February 25th, the team planned to finish the entire project. Morning of February 25th, 2022. It was the final day of the job. After weeks of work, Christopher, Faisal, Kazim, Rishi, and Yusuf had breakfast, got dressed, said goodbye to their families, and headed to work. Once they arrived at the site, they went through a safety briefing, discussed the day's tasks, and reviewed potential risks. After the meeting, the team put on their diving gear. With oxygen tanks on their backs, the 5 men paused for a group photo before jumping off the platform into the water. They descended to a depth of 4.5 meters and soon entered the oxygen-filled habitat chamber. By 1345, they were almost ready to install the new section of pipe, but first they had to remove the 2 plugs. The team removed the large upper metal cover. Then all 5 surfaced for lunch. At 14:15, for divers, Chris, Yusuf, Rishi, and Faisal returned to the chamber after eating. The fifth diver, Kazim Ali Jr., remained on the surface to monitor their work. What happened next unfolded with terrifying speed. Here is the timeline. At 1440, for divers, Chris, Faisal, Rishi, and Yusuf were working inside the habitat chamber above the 75 centimeters pipe. The absolute pressure inside the chamber was 1.45 bar, 45% above normal atmospheric pressure. Breathing felt slightly heavier, but the body adapted quickly. No extreme stress. Now it was time to remove the second plug. The fifth diver needed to bring them a spare adjustable wrench. The nut wouldn't budge without it. At 1443, Kazim Ali Jr. descended to the habitat chamber with the wrench. His GoPro camera, mounted on his helmet, recorded everything. The footage shows Kazim handing over the tool and climbing back up to join the team. But what happened next turned into a nightmare for all 5 men. At 1445, one of the divers loosened a valve to extract the lower plug. Suddenly, an unforeseen catastrophe occurred. In an instant, there was a violent pressure surge, so powerful that a massive vortex of air sucked them all toward the pipeline like water down a drain. The pipe's diameter was barely wider than an adult's shoulders. One after another, Rishi, Faisal, Yusuf, Kazim, and Chris were pulled headfirst into pitch-black darkness. All their diving gear hung inside the chamber was dragged along with them. They were first sucked 16 meters down to a bend in the pipe, known as an elbow, then pulled farther along the horizontal section on the seabed. At 1446, 20 seconds later, the pressure equalized. At that moment, all 5 divers were approximately 215 meters from the entrance at berth 6. The divers were now at a depth of about 16 meters inside the pipeline, experiencing an ambient pressure of 2.57 bar. Their bodies began saturating with inert gas, meaning that any rescue would require extensive decompression. All of them suffered various injuries, fractures, dislocations, and some bleeding. They were half submerged in oily liquid, but miraculously, an air pocket formed above their heads, the air that had been sucked in with them from the habitat. Lying on their backs in total darkness, disoriented, covered in oil, and in pain, they craned their necks out of the liquid to breathe. The pipe was too narrow to turn around. Closest to the berth 6 exit lay Christopher Boudram. Behind him came Kazim, Yusuf, Faisal, and farthest of all, Rishi. At 1455, surface operators realized something had gone terribly wrong underwater. A rescue diver was sent down. He entered the habitat and found it empty. He descended to 16 meters and searched the seabed around the riser, but found no trace of the 5 men. The rescue diver returned to the surface and raised the alarm. From that moment, a desperate race against time began for the 5 trapped divers. The oxygen in the pipe was running out fast. Chris Boudram knew that if they stayed put, they were all doomed. But there was a problem. They weren't sure which direction led to the surface. If they crawled the wrong way, they could end up sealed in by a blind flange at the other end. The most experienced diver, 50-year-old Faisal Kurban, explained the correct direction, toward berth 6. The decision to crawl one way or the other would prove fateful for some of the exhausted men. While Faisal made his way toward the others in total darkness, he managed to feel one of the oxygen tanks. From time to time, he could breathe from it, but the others had no tanks. Eventually, Chris, Kazim, Faisal, and Yusuf began crawling toward berth 6. Chris led the way. They found a painful but steady rhythm, scraping along the pipe walls with their hands and feet, pushing forward through the oily liquid. As they moved, Chris bumped into another oxygen tank. Now they could share 2 tanks between 4 men, Chris and Kazim on one, Faisal and Yusuf on the other. When they reached the end of the air pocket, Chris took 1 tank and submerged in the oily water to scout ahead. He swam in total darkness for about 4 minutes before realizing the terrible truth. The next air pocket was too far away. They were 4 men but only 2 tanks. Chris surfaced and returned to the others. He delivered the heartbreaking news they couldn't all make it. Kazim and Yusuf begged him not to leave, but Faisal understood. Chris was the least injured and had to go alone to get help. If they delayed, the rescue might take too long, or the air would run out entirely. Kazim Ali, one of Chris's oldest friends, was in a state of terror. He grabbed Chris's leg, pleading with him not to abandon them. But Chris knew he had no choice. With a heavy heart, he pushed his friend's hand away. Then Christopher Boudram took an oxygen tank and dove back into the water. With an injured hand and leg, he swam as fast as he could toward the next air pocket. When his first tank ran out, he switched to another. Eventually, he surfaced in a new air pocket. He heard his friend's distant cries behind him. Finally, he reached the elbow of the pipe. There, Chris stopped to pray that his efforts hadn't been in vain and that he was heading the right way. Desperately praying, he reached upward along the riser. At 1625, he broke the surface. Squinting through the stinging liquid, he saw light above him. But his nightmare wasn't over. The habitat chamber was empty. The water level in the riser was too low for him to reach the edge and climb out. And unfortunately, no one was inside the habitat to help him. Chris began to panic. But then he noticed a chain hanging in the water. He grabbed it and started banging it against the pipe, screaming for help. For about 20 minutes, he floated, calling out desperately. By some miracle, at 1645, 2 rescue divers entered the habitat. Within 3 minutes, they pulled Chris to the surface. Exhausted, he immediately told them about the situation inside the pipeline. For 2 agonizing hours, Chris had crawled through the pipe to escape. When he was finally pulled out, he begged the oil company to send help. His friends were still alive down there. Chris was taken by boat to shore and rushed to the hospital's intensive care unit. Meanwhile, 1 rescue diver remained in the habitat in case any of the others tried to escape. He activated 4 emergency signal buttons using the chain block and listened carefully for any response from inside the pipe. The trapped divers knocked back, and the rescue diver rushed to the surface to report that they were still alive and urgently needed help. At 1745, following information from the rescued diver, the surface crew prepared an air hose from the barge. On shore, Kazim Ali Jr.'s father, the owner of LMCS, analyzed the situation and told his team, "Put on your diving suits, go down there, and find out what's happening. If you can help them, do it. If not, come back immediately, and we'll figure out the next steps." When everything was ready, 3 volunteer divers returned to the habitat. They agreed that Faisal Kurban's son Michael, an experienced diver, would enter the pipe feet first with a long air hose. The other 2 would wait outside to pull him out if needed. Diving into the tiny, pitch-black, oil-filled pipe, Michael had no idea how far he'd need to go or in what condition he would find his father and the others. When he reached the elbow, the hose ran out. He had no choice but to turn back. By this time, news of the incident had spread across the island. At 1830, more experienced divers arrived. One brought commercial gear and a 91-meter hose. The group developed a new plan. The professional diver would enter the pipe until he reached the trapped men, tie a rope to one of them, and allow the surface team to pull him out. But just as they prepared to dive, Paria, the state oil company that owned the pipeline, asked them to wait. They said the Coast Guard was on the way. The divers reluctantly agreed. Around the same time, dull thuds were heard near the riser at berth 5. It was Rishi Nagasar. Despite his injuries, he had decided at some point to leave the other 3 and crawl in the opposite direction, toward berth 5. That section was filled with the most residual oil, making progress even more difficult. Around 2000 hours, more thuds were heard in the riser at berth 5. 5.5 hours after the incident began, the Coast Guard arrived at berth 6 with terrible news. To the divers' fury, the Coast Guard said they would not enter the pipe or even the habitat. They lacked the experience and specialized personnel. 2 rescue divers decided to make another attempt on their own. But as they prepared to dive, armed Coast Guard officers ordered them to stop. They explained that, by order of Paria's management, no one else was allowed in the water. At 2045, the 4 divers had been trapped for 6 hours under pressure, making any rescue increasingly dangerous due to severe decompression sickness. At midnight, the surface team conducted a video inspection using a baroscope camera. It was lowered into the riser at berth 6 and transmitted images to the divers in the habitat. When the camera reached the elbow, it hit an oxygen tank lying on the bottom and couldn't proceed. The team retrieved the camera and waited for a new crawler-style video inspection system. At 2:30 a.m. on Saturday, more dull thuds were heard near berth 5. At 3:15 a.m., the crawler arrived and began work from berth 6. It reached the elbow but was blocked by the same oxygen tank. Over the next half hour, it managed to push the tank only about 32 meters from the elbow. The team decided to send the crawler to the other side, berth 5. At 5:45 a.m., divers removed the blind flange from the riser at berth 5. No one seemed to notice, but this action lowered the water level in berth 6 riser by about 11 meters. The mass of water shifted, and, most critically, the pressure inside the pipeline dropped rapidly to atmospheric levels. The 4 divers, who had been sealed in the pressurized pipe for nearly 14 hours, underwent explosive decompression in less than an hour. Their fate was sealed. Nothing could save them now. But the rescuers didn't realize what had happened. They sent the crawler down berth 5, where it advanced only a few meters before being blocked by thick oil. The robot was retrieved and sent back for cleaning. From Friday night into Saturday, relatives of the 4 trapped men waited in the parking lot of the oil company. Rain fell and they sheltered in their cars, desperately needing information, but no one from Peria would speak to them. When the rain stopped early in the morning, word came that the company would hold a meeting later that day. At 2 p.m., Peria representatives told the families they were doing everything possible to save their loved ones. But in reality, the previous evening, Peria had banned all divers from entering the pipe or attempting rescue. At 5 p.m., the families continued their vigil in the parking lot. Peria still refused to allow volunteer divers into the pipe. Meanwhile, Kazım's father tried to meet with Peria's CEO to convince him to approve another rescue attempt under LMCS supervision. He finally reached the director by phone, but the CEO said he was out of town with his wife and would consider the plan the next morning. On Sunday, February 27th, Peria officially declared the operation a recovery, not a rescue. They understood there was no one left to save. Faisal Kurban's son Michael was overcome with rage and grief. He had spent 2 days at the Peria office and berth 6 trying to save his father. He went to the parking lot and held his own impromptu press conference. He told the waiting crowd and journalists that he and other divers had been ready and equipped to enter the pipe, but armed guards had blocked their way. Meanwhile, Peria decided to completely flood the pipeline with seawater under pressure. All employees' phones were temporarily confiscated to prevent leaks. By Monday morning, February 28th, the pipeline was fully flooded. Bodies began to be pumped out under pressure. At 17:53, the first bodies emerged slowly, followed by 3 oxygen tanks. But only 3 of the 4 missing divers came up. The 3 were taken to the Forensic Center for autopsy and identification. Rescuers knew 2 of them were Faisal and Yusuf, but the third could be either Kazım Ali Jr. or Rishi Nagasar. Both were similar in height and wore identical suits. Rishi's wife Vanessa was called in to identify the third body. She said it was not her husband. At that moment, everyone realized Rishi Nagasar was still trapped in the pipe. He had been the farthest from the exit and had crawled toward the opposite end. Finally, 3 days later, Rishi's body was recovered. LMCS issued a statement accusing Peria of preventing the rescue of its divers. Autopsies later revealed that the deaths were not instantaneous. One of the men remained conscious and waited for help inside the pipe for the next 39 hours. The team of 5 divers had no idea that draining the oil nearly a month earlier would create a sudden pressure differential. Unfortunately, during the final stages of work, they didn't follow strict operational sequence. For convenience, they decided to use a method from 2 years prior and removed the lower plug before attaching the new riser section. A state commission investigation concluded that the deaths resulted from gross negligence by Peria's management, leading to the unintentional deaths of the divers. The report stated that Peria failed to fulfill its obligations to ensure the safety of the divers. Peria admitted it had no specific rescue plan but denied legal responsibility for the contracted divers. The company claimed that any rescue attempt would have been unsafe and that blocking further dives prevented additional deaths. But was it really possible to save all 4? There was a small chance, especially in the first hours. Yet no one in the rescue operation considered the depth, the absolute pressure inside the pipeline, or the time that had passed. After 6 hours at 16 meters depth, the divers were heavily saturated with inert gas. Any rescue attempt after that would almost certainly have failed. In September 2024, authorities charged the management of both Peria and LMCS. All defendants deny guilt. The trial is scheduled for October 9, 2025, to allow both sides to review evidence and prepare defenses. As for the sole survivor, Christopher Boudram, he was psychologically shattered. Not a day goes by that he doesn't think of his 4 colleagues. The incident left him with deep phobias, so severe that he can no longer work as a diver or even swim with his family near the shore.